The chandeliers hung like frozen stars above the grand Washington ballroom, their crystal facets catching light and scattering it across a sea of black tuxedos and champagne flutes. The air was thick, not just with the perfume of wealth and the musk of ambition, but with something else. Something electric, something dangerous. It was the kind of night where history doesn't just happen, it gets made. And tonight, in front of America's most powerful conservatives, one man would rise while another would fall so hard the impact would shake the foundations of the Republican Party itself. Vice President J.D. Vance stood backstage, his hand resting on the velvet curtain, feeling the weight of 200 million eyes he couldn't see but knew were watching. His jaw was set, his breathing steady. He had walked through fire before, the kind that burns away everything false and leaves only what's real. Tonight he would walk through it again. But this time, the flames wouldn't come from enemies across the aisle. They would come from a man who once stood beside him. A man who had worn the same title, carried the same responsibilities, and made a choice that millions would never forgive. Former Vice President Mike Pence. The room beyond the curtain erupted in applause as President Donald Trump concluded his keynote address. The sound was deafening, primal, a roar of devotion that could have shaken the walls if walls could feel fear. Trump's words had been fire and thunder, a reminder to every person in that ballroom that the movement he had built was not a political party, it was a reckoning. And as the applause began to fade, as Trump exited stage left with the confident stride of a man who knew he owned the room, J.D. Vance prepared to take his place at the podium. But he never made it. Before his foot could touch the first step, before the applause could fully die, a voice sliced through the air like a blade through silk. It was calm, it was cold, and it was unmistakable. "Before we celebrate echoes," the voice said, "perhaps we should demand originals." The room froze. Every fork stopped midair. Every conversation died in a single breath. Every head turned toward the source of that voice, and what they saw made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. Mike Pence was standing, not at his assigned seat near the back, but at a secondary microphone that had been set up for introductions. His hand gripped it like a weapon. His face was a mask of righteous indignation. His eyes locked onto J.D. Vance's back with the intensity of a predator who had been waiting, watching, preparing for this exact moment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of shock, full of dread, full of the terrible realization that something unrehearsed, something unscripted, something devastating was about to unfold. J.D. Vance stopped walking. He didn't turn around. Not yet. He simply stood there, frozen in the spotlight, his silhouette a study in stillness. The cameras swiveled toward him, their lenses hungry, their operators sensing that what was about to happen would be replayed a million times before the sun rose. Pence smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he held all the cards, who thought he had calculated every angle, who was about to learn that some battles cannot be won with strategy alone. J.D. Vance, Pence continued, his voice now amplified through the speakers, filling every corner of the vast hall, is a good soldier. He follows orders. He speaks the lines he's been given. But leadership, true leadership, requires something he doesn't possess, a soul of his own. The gasp that swept through the crowd was audible, physical, a wave of collective disbelief. This wasn't a debate. This wasn't a disagreement between colleagues. This was an execution attempt, a public assassination designed to destroy a man's credibility, his reputation, his future. But Mike Pence had made one fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten who J.D. Vance was. Slowly, deliberately, with a control that seemed almost supernatural, J.D. Vance turned around. His face was calm. His eyes were clear. There was no anger, no surprise, no fear, just a quiet, terrible certainty. He took one step toward the podium, then another. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the silence like a heartbeat. When he reached the microphone, he adjusted it with the casual precision of a surgeon preparing to operate. He leaned in, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud. It was a whisper, but that whisper carried across the room with the force of a thunderclap. "Mike," he said, and the name hung in the air like an accusation. "If my voice is an echo of a great man, what is yours?" the silence of a man who ran, or the whisper of the enemies you now serve. The room shattered. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. The feeling of watching something break that can never be repaired. The feeling of witnessing a truth so devastating, so perfectly aimed that it doesn't just wound, it annihilates. Mike Pence's face, which had been a mask of confident authority, crumbled. The smile evaporated. His eyes widened, not with anger but with something far worse. Recognition. The recognition that he had walked into a trap of his own making, that he had brought a knife to a gunfight, that the man he had tried to humiliate was about to dismantle him piece by piece in front of the entire world. Someone in the back of the room dropped a fork. The clatter was deafening. And in that moment, the carefully constructed narrative that Mike Pence had spent years building, the narrative of the principled statesman, the constitutional guardian, the man who had stood for truth against tyranny, began to collapse. Because J.D. Vance hadn't just asked a question. He had drawn a line, and everyone in that room, everyone watching at home, everyone who had ever felt betrayed by a leader who chose comfort over courage, knew exactly which side of that line they stood on. This was not a political dispute. This was a trial, and the verdict had already been written in the faces of the people in that room, in their silence, in the way they leaned forward, desperate to hear what would come next. The battle for the soul of the Republican Party had begun. And it would be won not with shouting, not with rage, but with a single, devastating truth. To understand the weapon J.D. Vance had just deployed, you must first understand the man who forged it. He was not born in boardrooms or bred in the marble halls of Washington power. He was a child of the Rust Belt, a son of Appalachia, a witness to the slow, grinding death of the American working class. His childhood was not one of privilege. It was a battlefield. He grew up in a world where fathers disappeared into the night, where mothers fought demons that had no names, where grandmothers became the last line of defense between a boy and the abyss. He knew what it meant to be hungry, not for food, though there were nights when that too was uncertain, but for hope, for a sign that the world beyond the hills and the shuttered factories and the abandoned homes held something more than despair. The Marine Corps saved him. It gave him structure when his life had none. It taught him discipline when everything around him was chaos. It showed him that a man could be broken down to nothing and rebuilt into something stronger, something unbreakable. He learned to follow orders, yes, but more importantly, he learned when to disobey them. He learned that true courage wasn't following a command you agreed with. It was standing your ground when everyone else was running. Yale Law School was supposed to be his escape, his ticket to the world of power and influence. And it was. But it was also an awakening. He walked through those hallowed halls, sat in those prestigious classrooms, and realized with a cold, clarifying horror that the people who ran this country, the professors, the politicians, the pundits, looked at his people, the people he had left behind, with contempt. They didn't see them as Americans who deserved help. They saw them as problems to be managed, statistics to be manipulated, votes to be harvested and discarded. He learned to speak their language. He learned to wear their clothes, to drink their wine, to laugh at their jokes. But he never forgot. He never forgot the face of his grandmother, the woman who had raised him, the woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed. He never forgot the men in his hometown who had built this country with their hands and were told they were obsolete. He never forgot the rage, the quiet, simmering rage of a people who had been abandoned by the very institutions that claimed to serve them. When Donald Trump descended that golden escalator and declared war on the establishment, J.D. Vance watched. At first, he was skeptical. Trump was everything his Yale professors had taught him to distrust: brash, unpolished, unpredictable. But then he went to a rally, not as a journalist or a critic, but as a man trying to understand. And what he saw changed everything. He saw faces. Faces of people who looked like his grandmother. Faces of men who looked like the ones he had grown up with. And he heard their voices. Not the sanitized, focus-grouped voices of political ads, but raw, desperate voices of people who had been lied to for so long they had stopped believing in anything. And they believed in Trump. Not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to fight for them when no one else would. J.D. Vance didn't join the Trump movement out of ambition. He joined it out of recognition. He recognized in Trump's fiery, uncompromising defiance, the same rage he had felt his entire life. The rage of the forgotten, the discarded, the betrayed. And when Trump chose him as his running mate, when he stood on that stage and offered J.D. Vance the second most powerful position in the country, it wasn't just a political calculation. It was a validation. A validation that the boy from the hills, the Marine, the survivor, had earned his place at the table, not by kissing rings, but by refusing to bow. Mike Pence came from a different world. His path was straight, predictable, safe. He was a radio host, then a congressman, then a governor, then a vice president. Each step was carefully planned, each move calculated. He was a man of faith, a man of principle, a man who believed in institutions. He believed that if you followed the rules, if you played the game the right way, you would be rewarded. He was the Republican establishment's dream, polished, predictable, controllable. When Trump chose Pence as his running mate in 2016, it was a marriage of convenience. Trump was the chaos, the storm, the wrecking ball. Pence was the insurance policy, the reassurance to nervous donors and cautious evangelicals that the revolution could be contained. For 4 years, Pence played his role to perfection. He stood behind Trump at every rally, nodded at every speech, defended every decision. In his mind, he wasn't following Trump. He was guiding him, shepherding the movement toward something respectable, something sustainable. But Mike Pence made one critical miscalculation. He believed the movement was his to inherit. He believed that when the storm passed, when Trump was gone, the people would turn to him. The calm, reasonable, principled alternative. He never understood that the people didn't want calm. They didn't want reasonable. They wanted a fighter. And when the moment came, when the pressure was at its peak, Mike Pence ran. January 6th, the day that would define him forever. On one side was the president, the movement, the millions of voters who believed their voices had been silenced. On the other was the Constitution, the establishment, the comfortable world of Washington elites who had always despised him but now offered him something he craved, their approval. He chose the Constitution, or so he told himself. In truth, he chose safety. He chose the path that would earn him editorials in the New York Times calling him a hero. He chose the applause of people who had spent 4 years calling him a theocratic fanatic. He chose to be remembered by history, but he forgot to consider which history would remember him. To the people J.D. Vance represented, Mike Pence's choice was not principled. It was betrayal. It was a father abandoning his children in the middle of a storm because the neighbors promised him a warm bed and a hot meal. It was a soldier dropping his rifle and running while his brothers bled. And no amount of praise from CNN, no glowing profiles in the Washington Post could change that. So when Mike Pence stood in that ballroom and called J.D. Vance a puppet, he wasn't just insulting a man. He was insulting the millions of people who saw themselves in Vance. He was dismissing their pain, their rage, their desperate need for someone who wouldn't abandon them. He was saying, in effect, that loyalty to a leader who fought for them was weakness, that standing your ground was foolishness, that running away was courage. And J.D. Vance, standing at that podium, had just asked him to defend that claim. The silence in the ballroom was no longer just absence. It was presence. It pressed down on Mike Pence from every direction, suffocating, inescapable. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. His mind, which had rehearsed this confrontation 100 times, which had prepared clever retorts and devastating counters, was blank. He had spent so much time imagining Vance as a mindless loyalist, a puppet without thoughts of his own, that he had never prepared for this. For intelligence, for precision, for a man who understood not just politics but pain. Pence's face flushed red, the color creeping up his neck like a tide of shame. His lips pressed together into a thin, bloodless line. His hands, which had been gesturing confidently moments before, now hung at his sides, trembling slightly. He looked out at the crowd, searching for an ally, a friendly face, someone who would nod in agreement, validate his position. But all he saw were cold, appraising stares. Donors who had written him checks now looked at him like a bad investment. Senators who had called him a friend now studied their water glasses with intense fascination. He was alone. J.D. Vance didn't move. He didn't press the advantage. He simply stood there, calm and still, letting the weight of his question do the work. The contrast between the two men was stark. Pence, rigid and flustered, radiating desperate energy. Vance, relaxed and centered, a man who had already won and was now simply allowing his opponent to realize it. Then Vance spoke again. His voice was low, conversational, almost gentle, but every word was a hammer blow. I stood with a president who was attacked relentlessly by the very people who now invite you to their dinner parties, Mike. The words hung in the air, each one a small detonation. The reporters in the press box stopped taking notes. The donors stopped pretending to check their phones. Every eye in the room was locked on the stage. You speak of soul, Vance continued, taking a single step forward. But what becomes of a soul when it values the approval of its enemies more than the loyalty of its friends? You ran from the fight the moment the arrows started flying, right into the arms of the archers. Pence finally found his voice, but it was weak, strained, nothing like the commanding baritone the world knew. "That's a lie," he managed, the words coming out defensive, almost plaintive. "I upheld my oath to the Constitution." "No one is questioning your oath to a document," Vance shot back, his tone sharp but controlled. "We're questioning your oath to the people who trusted you. You talk about leadership. Is it leadership to abandon your soldiers on the battlefield because the enemy promises you a comfortable retirement?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was low, subtle, but unmistakable. Vance had just articulated something they had all felt but couldn't name. The betrayal. The sense that Pence hadn't stood for principle, he had stood for his own future. "You call me a puppet," Vance said, his eyes scanning the front row before returning to Pence. "But I've never seen a man more controlled by the strings of his own fear. You obeyed your fear of the media. You obeyed your fear of being cast out by the Washington elite. I obeyed my conscience. And my conscience tells me you never stabbed the man in the back who put you on that stage in the first place." Pence's lips trembled. He looked desperately at the audience again, but this time he didn't find even the pretense of support. A woman in the third row, a county party chair from Michigan, began to clap. It was slow at first, deliberate, a single person's endorsement. Then another joined. Then another. The applause grew, not into a wave, but into a steady, rising tide. It was hesitant at first, uncertain, but it was real. From the wings, President Trump watched on a monitor. His face was impassive, but his eyes held a look of vindicated pride. He had chosen Vance not for his polish, but for his spine. And tonight, that spine was proving to be unbreakable. Pence tried to retreat. He took a half step back from the microphone, a gesture of surrender. But J.D. Vance wasn't finished. He took another step forward, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to lean in. "You want to talk about conviction, Mike?" Vance asked. "Where was your conviction when our cities were burning in the summer of 2020, when the media was calling every patriot a racist? Where were you?" He paused, letting the question hang. "I'll tell you where you were. You were hiding behind press releases and praying for it all to go away. Real Americans were losing their businesses, their homes, their country, and you were silent." The livestream viewer count surged past 2 million. Social media exploded. The confrontation had gone from a ballroom drama to a national event in minutes. Pence's back was now almost completely to the audience. He muttered something, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand the pressures of that office." "No," Vance's voice cut back like a shard of glass. "You don't understand the meaning of standing your ground." He turned slightly, addressing not just Pence but the entire room, the entire country. "Leadership isn't about avoiding criticism. It isn't about seeking applause from editorial boards. It's about choosing what's right, even when it costs you everything. It's about being willing to be hated by the right people." He glanced back at Pence, his expression not of anger, but of something closer to pity. "That's a lesson you seem to have unlearned the moment you traded your integrity for a favorable headline." Pence's face drained of color. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, the ghost of who he used to be. Then Vance delivered the final blow, the sentence that would be quoted, replayed, and remembered for years. "You were Donald Trump's vice president, Mike. Now you're a footnote in a history book you allowed the Democrats to write for you." The room wasn't just stunned. It felt wounded. Mike Pence looked like a man who knew, with absolute certainty, that his political career had just ended. Not with applause, not with dignity, but with the cold, brutal truth he had spent years trying to avoid. The applause subsided, replaced by thick, heavy silence. People weren't whispering. They were thinking, reevaluating, reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the man standing frozen by that secondary microphone. J.D. Vance walked slowly past Pence. He didn't spare him a glance. His focus was on the crowd, on the cameras, on the millions watching beyond the ballroom walls. When he reached the podium, he placed his hands on either side of it, grounding himself, connecting with the gravity of the moment. "This isn't about personal animosity," Vance said, his voice steady, solemn. "This is about an infection that's been allowed to fester in our party for too long, an infection of cowardice that masquerades as civility." He looked directly into the main camera, forging a connection with every person watching. "The truth is, some men are given the honor of wearing the title of vice president, but they treat it not as a sacred trust but as a stepping stone, a bargaining chip to secure their own future, to keep their invitations to the right parties." Pence's jaw clenched. The reference was unmistakable. His eyes darted toward a group of donors at a nearby table. One of them, a billionaire industrialist who had funded his campaigns, slowly shook his head. Another turned his chair away, a small but brutal act of public disassociation. "You betrayed more than a man," Vance continued. "You betrayed every single voter who stood in line for hours, who put a sign in their yard, who believed you when you said you'd fight for them. They didn't send you to Washington to win approval from the media. They sent you to be their voice. And when their voice needed to be loudest, you chose silence." A woman near the front began to cry, quiet, heartbreaking sobs. She was a small business owner from Pennsylvania whose restaurant had been forced to close during the lockdowns. She remembered Pence's carefully worded statements that said nothing, offered no hope, did nothing. Vance's words weren't just political rhetoric to her. They were validation of her pain. "This party, this movement is not perfect," Vance said, turning back to the room. "We're flawed. We make mistakes. But what we cannot afford, what we must not tolerate, are traitors from within. We don't need more carefully polished men who run from the fight. We need fighters. And I will not stand by and let history be rewritten by men who fled the battlefield." The room erupted. No hesitation this time. A spontaneous, overwhelming roar. People leaped to their feet. The applause was a thunderous wave that shook the chandeliers. Mike Pence visibly shrank under the sonic assault. It was the sound of his political obituary being written in real time. He took a shaky breath, a desperate attempt to reclaim dignity. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "You think you know," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger at Vance. "You weren't in the room. You don't know the pressure, the chaos." "I know what loyalty is," Vance interrupted, silencing the applause instantly. The room froze. Pence's hand trembled violently. "You're a child in this arena. J.D. You rode to power on President Trump's coattails. I helped build that legacy. You're walking in shoes you didn't earn." A thin, hard line formed on Vance's lips. He paused, letting the accusation hang, letting its petty bitterness expose itself. Then he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, yet every person heard it as if it had been shouted. "The difference between you and me, Mike, is that I never once considered spitting on the man who gave me the shoes." A groan of empathetic pain echoed across the room. Everyone knew it was over. Vance stepped forward, his movements imbued with undeniable authority. He was no longer just the vice president. He was the leader. "You act as if you carried some great burden," he said, his voice laced with cold contempt. "But when the moment of truth arrived, you handed the pen to the enemy and let them write the story. You let them call us traitors. You let them call us insurrectionists. You validated every lie they told about us, all for a pat on the head." Older men in the audience, veterans by their posture and pins, nodded in agreement. One wearing a Vietnam veteran cap slowly, painfully got to his feet and began to clap, alone at first. His solitary applause a stark, powerful endorsement. Then J.D. Vance did something no one expected. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a slim manila folder. The room held its breath. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a copy of emails and text messages between the office of former Vice President Pence and several Democrat-aligned political action committees. He let that sink in. The dates are what's important. They begin just 2 weeks after January 6th, long before Mr. Pence told the American people he was praying for wisdom. He was already negotiating the terms of his surrender, including speaking fees and commitments for a future presidential run. The room gasped as one. A journalist literally jumped to his feet for a better angle, his camera flashing like a strobe. Pence's eyes widened in terror. That's classified information," he barked, his voice raw with panic. "Not anymore," Vance replied, his tone cold and calm. "The relevant sections were declassified last night. I made sure of it." He looked at Pence. "You see, Mike, transparency isn't betrayal. Scheming with the opposition while pretending to be a man of principle, that is." He walked to the podium and laid the folder down with a soft, final thud. "This isn't an act of revenge," Vance said, his voice filled with weary sadness. "It's a revelation. The people who trusted you, who prayed for you, deserve to know who you truly became the moment you thought the cameras were off." Pence's shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He had no words, no defense. The silence was not awkward, it was the silence of a tomb. Even President Trump, still watching from the wings, turned to an aide and whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and grim finality. He just ended him. The truth had landed. And in that devastating moment, Mike Pence finally understood. He hadn't just insulted J.D. Vance. He had awakened a force he never knew existed. Outside the grand Washington ballroom, the world was exploding. News vans swarmed like predators catching the scent of blood. Reporters stood bathed in harsh camera lights, speaking in breathless, urgent tones. Breaking news banners scrolled across every television screen. Pence career in tatters after Vance revelation. Trump VP ACCUSCS former VP of betrayal. GOP civil war is here. Twitter was no longer a platform. It was a digital supernova. Hashtags trended worldwide within minutes. Video clips shot on shaky phones were uploaded, shared, replayed millions of times, every frame dissected, every microexpression analyzed. Pence's trembling lip, Vance's unblinking stare, the folder landing on the podium. The mainstream media, the institutions Pence had sought to appease, turned on him with swift, merciless brutality. Pundits who had hailed him as a hero months before now framed him as a tragic fallen figure. They spoke of him in the past tense, as if he were already a ghost. They didn't defend him. They analyzed his downfall with detached clinical interest. But the reaction in the heartland was different. On front porches in Ohio, in diners in Pennsylvania, in church basements in Iowa, people watched the clips and wept, not with glee, with relief. For years, they had felt betrayed by leaders who abandoned them for establishment comforts. Tonight, they watched someone finally say no. Someone who came from their world, who understood their pain, stand on the biggest stage and refuse to play the game. He hadn't just defended Trump. He had defended them, their honor, their belief in loyalty, their conviction that you don't abandon your own, no matter how hot the fire gets. He had taken their quiet, private grief and turned it into a public, righteous roar. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere transformed. The shock gave way to somber energy. The folder on the podium was like a sacred object, a testament to truth spoken at great cost. J.D. Vance stood still, letting reality settle. He didn't look triumphant. He looked burdened, like a man forced to reveal a terrible family secret for the family's own good. Pence stepped back from the microphone, his movement slow and clumsy. His face was pale, bloodless. His hand fumbled in his pocket for something that wasn't there. A phone, a handkerchief, an escape. The stage lights that had been his element now felt like interrogation lamps, exposing every flaw, every flicker of shame. Senators who had considered Pence a friend looked away. They were embarrassed not just for him, but by him. A prominent pastor from Indiana, one of Pence's earliest supporters, quietly folded his hands and bowed his head as if in prayer for a lost soul. Vance cleared his throat, the sound amplified in the silence. "Mike," he said, and the use of his first name was unbearable pity. "You said I was a puppet, but puppets don't bring truth to light. Traitors do everything they can to keep it buried." A woman in the front row, a Gold Star mother with a small flag pin on her lapel, wiped a tear from her cheek. Her son had died in Afghanistan. She had voted for Pence twice. Pence's actions after January 6th felt like a personal betrayal, a dishonor to her son's sacrifice. Tonight, she felt justice. Painful but necessary cleansing. Pence tried to speak one last time. His mouth opened, but only a broken whisper came out. This isn't fair. But J.D. Vance had only just begun. The folder was not the end. It was the beginning. The public now saw Pence not as a man of principle, but as a hollow politician caught scheming. They saw Vance not as a Trump sycophant, but as a defender, a warrior for the forgotten. The old guard was fallen. A new one was rising from the ashes. Just as the weight of Pence's demise seemed to settle permanently, new energy stirred. It started at the back of the ballroom. A murmur, a ripple. Heads turned one by one, then entire sections, like sunflowers turning toward a rising sun. The double doors at the main entrance swung open. And there, silhouetted against brighter light, stood a figure instantly recognizable to every person in the room and millions watching around the world. President Donald J. Trump. He didn't speak, didn't wave. He simply stood there, letting his presence register, a living embodiment of the entire conflict that had just torn the room apart. The cameras spun around, desperate to capture this monumental development. Mike Pence visibly tensed. If his posture had been one of defeat before, it now became pure dread. He looked like a man who, having survived a shipwreck, now saw a shark's dorsal fin cutting through the water toward him. Slowly, with deliberate, regal pace, Trump began walking down the center aisle. The space parted as if by invisible force. People who had been standing now stood straighter, awe and reverence on their faces. He wasn't just a politician entering a room. He was a symbol walking through his temple. His face was grim, unreadable, which amplified the tension. He wasn't smiling, wasn't scowling. He was observing, assessing, his eyes sweeping across the room with the cool gaze of a general surveying a victorious but costly battlefield. J.D. Vance turned toward the approaching figure. He didn't look relieved or triumphant. He looked like a loyal soldier at attention. He gave a single sharp nod of respect as Trump drew near. Then he did something that spoke volumes. He stepped aside, physically moved away from the podium, ceding the spotlight he'd earned, making clear this moment was no longer about him. Trump reached the stage and stepped up, movements fluid and confident. He walked to the podium, placed his hands on it, and looked out over the sea of faces. The silence was absolute anticipation, 1,000 hearts beating in suspended rhythm. He let the moment hang for 10 seconds, a master of dramatic timing. Then his gaze shifted to the man standing broken and isolated a few feet away. He looked at Mike Pence, not with anger or hatred, with cold, profound disappointment, the look of a father regarding a son who had failed him fundamentally. "You know," Trump began, his voice calm, conversational, yet filling every corner, "I've been watching from the side, and I have to say I've never been prouder of a vice president than I am of the man who just stood here." Vance's face remained calm, no flicker of pride, no smile. This wasn't victory to celebrate, it was duty performed. Trump placed a hand on Vance's shoulder. "Loyalty," he said, his voice gaining strength, "is not blind obedience. Anyone who tells you that is selling something. Loyalty is having the courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it's ugly, especially when it hurts." Then Trump turned his full attention toward Pence. The weight of that gaze seemed to make Pence physically smaller. "I put my trust in you, Mike," Trump said, his voice low and heavy with personal betrayal. "And you broke that trust, but that's not the worst part. You didn't just break my trust." He paused. "You broke the trust of every person in this room, and every person in this country who believed in you." Pence looked away, unable to meet his eyes. He stared at the floor, at the exit, at anything but the face of the man he'd once served. Then Trump delivered the line that would define the night, both brutal condemnation and perfect poetic summation. He glanced at Vance, then back at Pence. "You stood up here and called J.D. a puppet," Trump said, a slight mirthless smile touching his lips. "But what you failed to realize, Mike, is that tonight he pulled your strings without ever laying a hand on you. The room broke. The carefully maintained dam of decorum burst. A roar went up. Raw, visceral catharsis and affirmation. Not just for Trump or Vance, but for restoration of an order they believed in. People shouted. Others cried openly, tears of relief and vindication streaming down their faces. The torch hadn't just been passed. It had been ripped from a traitor's hand by a true believer. The roar was a physical force, a wave washing over Mike Pence, erasing what little remained of his public stature. He stood blinking rapidly, as if the sheer volume was physical assault. Camera flashes were relentless, a barrage of white light capturing his humiliation from every angle, preserving it for eternity. He was no longer a participant. He was a historical artifact being publicly decommissioned. J.D. Vance had moved back to the podium, standing beside Trump, not in front. A subtle but powerful visual of restored order. Trump's arm was still across his shoulders. A silent, unyielding statement of alliance. The room was packed, yet focus had narrowed to these two men, the air around them electric. Every major network had cut away from regular programming. This wasn't just political news. It was national spectacle. YouTube streams buckled under traffic, numbers spiking into millions. "America," Vance began, his voice cutting through fading applause, regaining command with renewed authority. He looked past the audience into the camera, speaking directly to the nation. "Our country isn't perfect. We've been bruised, lied to by our media, our institutions, sometimes even our own leaders." He didn't look at Pence, didn't have to. But no wound cuts deeper than betrayal from within. No pain is greater than the one inflicted by a man you once called brother. Someone in the crowd, a man with weathered face and calloused hands, choked back a sob. Raw, unguarded grief encapsulating feelings of millions. "When a man," Vance continued, voice low and steady, "chooses polite applause of his enemies over steadfast loyalty of his friends, he becomes smaller than his own shadow. He forfeits his right to lead." Pence turned his head, eyes finding exit doors at the back. They seemed a universe away. He was trapped in the spotlight, prisoner of the moment he'd created. He couldn't leave. To flee now would be final admission of guilt. Vance lifted the manila folder again, holding it not as weapon, but as somber evidence. "What's in this folder is not personal," he said, tone heavy with regret. "It's painful, but necessary, because this country cannot heal until we cleanse our house of people who helped arsonists light the match." Tears fell freely throughout the room. This was no longer about political maneuvering. It had deepened into a parable about loyalty, betrayal, and the soul of a nation. As the weight settled, a new unplanned interruption occurred. Near the stage, a man in a wheelchair was rolled forward by his teenage daughter. He was a veteran, face etched with hard life, jaw set with grim determination. Vance noticed him. He paused, attention shifting from cameras to the man. "Sir," Vance said, voice softening with genuine respect, "it looks like you have something to say." An aide rushed a wireless mic to the man. He took it in a gnarled hand, weathered by age and hardship. When he spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, shaking with emotion. "I served this country for 30 years, he began. "Under 3 presidents. I lost this leg in Afghanistan." He gestured to his missing limb. "But I never, not once, lost faith in this nation. Not until I watched Mike Pence certify that election and turn his back on President Trump." A fresh wave of gasps swept the room. He turned and pointed a trembling finger directly at Pence. "You stood on stages and talked about courage. You quoted the Bible. You told us to be strong. But when the real storm came, when the media and the whole damn swamp came for us, you ran for cover." Pence couldn't make eye contact. He stared at his shoes. The veteran turned back to Vance. "You," he said, voice thick with unshed tears. "Tonight you reminded me of a word I thought our leaders forgot. Honor." Vance blinked hard, composure momentarily shaken. He'd been prepared for political fight. Not this. Not raw, heartbreaking validation from a wounded warrior. The daughter placed a gentle hand on her father's shoulder. He took a deep breath and whispered, "That's all I wanted to say." Vance stepped back to the podium, his own voice quieter now, filled with new depth of emotion. America isn't asking for perfect leaders, he said, eyes finding the veteran. She's begging for honest ones. Even Pence's oldest allies, men who'd come intending to support him, now bowed their heads in shame. What started as a fundraiser had become something far more profound, a national reckoning, therapy for a movement's broken heart. At the center was raw, unvarnished truth spoken not just by a politician, but through tears and testimony of the very people who'd been betrayed. Mike Pence had always been a man of immense self-control. His public persona was a fortress built over decades with walls of discipline, faith, and calculated speech. But now, under relentless assault of Vance's truth, Trump's judgment, and the palpable grief of the people, the fortress began to crack. The mortar crumbled. The foundation gave way. "I tried," he finally muttered, words barely audible, a desperate plea for understanding. He looked up, eyes glassy with unshed tears, searching for a single sympathetic gaze. "I tried to do what I thought was right. I didn't mean for." "You didn't mean for what, Mike?" Vance cut in, tone not aggressive but firm, the voice of a surgeon refusing to let a patient look away from his wound. "You didn't mean to trade truth for your own political safety. You didn't mean to hurt millions who put faith in you. You didn't mean to let the media establishment write the final chapter of our administration." Pence's voice grew shaky, rising in pitch as composure finally shattered completely. I didn't think he could win again." The admission, torn from the deepest pragmatic corner of his soul, hung like toxic cloud. "I didn't want to go down with the ship." Silence, dead, profound, damning silence. In that single panicked confession, he'd validated every accusation, admitted his stand on principle was in fact political calculation, a bet, and he'd bet against them. Vance took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing remaining distance. He stood directly in front of Pence, forcing him to look at him. He didn't yell, didn't glower, simply locked eyes, his gaze a mixture of profound disappointment and cold, hard finality. "And that," Vance said, voice dropping to near whisper yet carrying the weight of death sentence, "is why you no longer belong here." Pence's lips trembled violently. He looked like he might collapse. His eyes darted to Trump, who stood with arms folded, expression hard and unforgiving as granite. No rescue from that quarter. He turned toward the crowd, last desperate appeal to the jury, but they were no longer with him. A sea of cold, alienated faces. Donors who'd known him for years slowly stood, turned their backs to the stage, and stood in silent, brutal protest. Excommunication more powerful than any shout. Vance didn't celebrate, didn't smile or raise a fist. He looked down, gathering strength to deliver final necessary eulogy. Then he leaned into the microphone, voice quiet, almost mournful. "Cowards," he said, the word resonating with power of biblical proverb, "run from the fire. Leaders walk through it for the people they serve." At that moment, it wasn't just Mike Pence exposed. It was the entire artifice of his political life. Every speech about courage, every invocation of faith, every claim to principled conservatism, reduced to ash, consumed by fire he'd refused to walk through. The man who'd entered to reclaim his place had instead been permanently cast out, not by rival, but by simple, unyielding force of truth he tried to hide. Outside the Capitol Grand Hall controlled chaos. News vans lined streets for blocks, satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic forest. Reporters shouted updates to producers. Headlines escalated. Pence's political career annihilated in live meltdown. Vance as undisputed heir to Trump. The Purge. New GOP draws line in the sand. Inside, the main program had concluded. Vance was seated in an armchair on stage next to Trump in hastily arranged Q&A. Pence had been quietly ushered to a seat in shadows at the far edge of front row. No longer participant, but spectator at his own wake. A reporter shouted first question. "Mr. Vice President Vance, after what we witnessed, do you believe there's still a place for Mike Pence in the Republican Party?" Room fell silent, eager for verdict. Vance looked up, expression thoughtful, voice firm but measured. "I believe our party is long overdue for a season of accountability," he began. Not the kind demanded by the left, but accountability from within. Accountability to our own principles and voters. The crowd murmured approval. We don't lose elections just because of the other side's lies or media bias. We lose them because of quiet, polite betrayals in our own ranks. When our leaders value compliments from CNN anchors more than trust of coal miners in West Virginia. He turned slightly, brief glance in Pence's direction before looking back. This was never about punishment. It's about purification, protecting the soul of the conservative movement so we don't wake up one day and find we've become the very people we swore to fight. Pence sat in shadows, a man erased. Light from stage barely touched him. He looked down at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for first time. Hands that had shaken thousands of others, signed bills, rested on the Bible during oath. Now just hands of a lonely, broken old man. And J.D. Vance's name, his presence, was rising like a storm no one, least of all Mike Pence, had seen coming. As the formal event concluded and the ballroom emptied, strange and somber quiet descended. The air, once electric then explosive, now felt heavy with finality. Pence rose from his seat in shadows, moved slowly, stiffly, like a man twice his age. No one approached. No one offered comforting hand or quiet word. Power brokers and donors who'd clamored for his attention hours earlier now averted gaze, suddenly fascinated by phones or acquaintances across the room. He'd become invisible, a ghost haunting the scene of his own demise. He walked through the center aisle, the same path Trump had taken in triumphant entrance. But for Pence, it was walk of shame, gauntlet of averted eyes and deliberate silence. People didn't move out of his way with respect. They simply leaned back in chairs, creating space around him. Quarantine zone of political contagion. He reached heavy oak doors and paused for single heartbreaking moment. Hand rested on brass handle, perhaps hoping someone would call his name, stop him, say something to lessen crushing weight of isolation. But there was only silence. Only sound was distant, polite applause for a final speaker on stage. In that silence, weight of his regret, his catastrophic miscalculation, hit with force of physical blow. He'd gambled everything on belief the party would tire of the fight, crave return to quiet, respectable politics he represented. He'd bet civility would be valued more than loyalty. And he'd lost everything. He pushed open the door and stepped into the foyer. Not into glare of cameras, but cold, empty expanse. No microphones thrust in his face. No reporters chasing him. The pack had moved on. He was old news. A chapter ended brutally and publicly. Meanwhile, near the stage, Vance was surrounded. Not by usual scrum of reporters and operatives. A slow, steady procession of ordinary people. They waited patiently, faces etched with emotion, for chance to speak to him, touch his shoulder, shake his hand. An old veteran in worn leather jacket, body stooped with age but eyes bright, stood waiting, leaning heavily on wooden cane. His lapel was constellation of medals, silent testament to life of service. Vietnam, Desert Storm, Purple Heart. When Vance finally reached him, the man didn't speak right away. Just looked into Vance's eyes, long searching gaze as if measuring depth of his soul. Then slowly, deliberately held out gnarled hand. "You spoke for us tonight, son," the soldier said, voice thick and shaking with emotion he'd likely suppressed for decades. "All of us who felt left behind. I've been waiting a long, long time to hear a man in Washington speak truth like that again." Vance gripped his hand firmly, throat tight. "It was an honor, sir. Thank you for your service." "No," the veteran replied, grip surprisingly strong, eyes watering. "Thank you for finally serving us." He turned to walk away, paused, looked back over shoulder. "Don't you ever change. You hear me? This country can't afford to lose another real one." Vance nodded, unable to speak, swallowing against lump in his throat. He stood still, watching the old man limp toward exit, and then he saw it all around him. People were crying. Not with loud performative grief of political rally, but quiet, profound tears of people given reason to hope again. A young mother holding sleeping toddler caught his eye and whispered, "That's our vice president." For first time all night, a small, genuine smile touched Vance's lips. not triumph or pride. Immense humbling gratitude. He didn't need applause, didn't need headlines. He had their hearts. And he knew with certainty that settled deep in his bones it was far greater and far heavier prize. Backstage in small, quiet holding room, weight of evening finally descended. Adrenaline faded, leaving profound emotional and physical exhaustion. He sat down heavily on sofa, shoulders slumping, and stared at muted gray carpet. The door opened quietly and Trump walked in holding 2 bottles of water. Didn't speak, just handed one to Vance and sat beside him. For a long moment, only sound was quiet hum of building's ventilation. Then Trump spoke, voice low and serious. "You didn't just defend me out there tonight, JD," he said, staring straight ahead. "You defended something much, much bigger than me." Vance looked over, taking slow sip. "I just told the truth, Mr. President." Trump let out short, soft chuckle devoid of usual bombast. "Yeah, but the truth isn't cheap. It costs something. You paid the price tonight." Vance nodded slowly. It was worth it. Trump grew quiet, then leaned in, voice dropping to almost conspiratorial whisper. "They love you now, the people. They see you as one of them. Don't ever let that change you. Don't let the power, the attention make you forget the look on that old soldier's face." Vance looked him directly in the eye, gaze clear and unwavering. "I'm not in this for power, sir. I'm in this to make sure no kid ever has to grow up in a country that makes them feel ashamed of where they come from." Trump studied his face for a long moment, then placed heavy hand on Vance's back and stood. "That," he said with decisive nod, "is exactly why you're going to go farther than any of them." He walked out, leaving Vance alone with his thoughts. The night was over, but the fight had just begun. This moment wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of something much bigger, much harder, and much more important than he could have ever imagined. By morning, the political landscape of America had been redrawn. The folder Vance had placed on the podium wasn't just prop, it was detonator. Scanned copies of declassified emails and texts were leaked to every major outlet overnight. They were damning, showed in cold, inarguable black and white a Mike Pence who was not a man agonizing over constitutional duty, but shrewd political operator actively courting favor and funding of the very people his base considered enemy. Emails with prominent Democrat strategists discussing rebranding the post-Trump GOP. Text messages with heads of Never Trump PACs outlining potential speaking tour and media appearances designed to offer more reasonable conservative alternative. The timeline was brutal, confirming Vance's claim these conversations began just days after January 6th. While embers were still hot, legal fallout was minimal. Pence had been careful not to cross lines into criminality, but political fallout was apocalyptic. The Republican National Committee issued terse one-sentence statement before 9:00 a.m. The RNC is focused on the future of the party. It was political execution. Major donors funding Pence's political operation began calling his chief of staff one by one to inform him support was being indefinitely suspended. His upcoming appearance on major Sunday political show was abruptly canceled, assistant citing last-minute scheduling conflict. Mike Pence had vanished, wasn't taking calls. His staff, or what was left of it, had no idea where he was. He'd slipped out of hotel in pre-dawn hours. Man in rumpled suit climbing into unmarked black car. Face hidden from single persistent photographer who'd bothered to wait. He was a man not just in disgrace but exile. An exile of his own making. In quiet, dimly lit diner somewhere in rural Virginia, he sat alone in corner booth, copy of Washington Post on table. Headline screamed, "Pence papers reveal shadow campaign." He stared into cup of black coffee, bitter liquid untouched. He remembered the feeling of standing on that stage, the confidence, the righteous certainty. It felt like memory from another man's life. Worst part wasn't hatred from MAGA base. He'd expected that. It was pitying, condescending tone of articles in very newspapers he'd sought to appease. They treated him not as fallen hero, but as clumsy amateur outmaneuvered. He hadn't just lost his party, he'd lost his dignity. And he finally understood in quiet hum of the diner that J.D. Vance hadn't destroyed him with anger. He'd done it with truth. Calm, steady, unforgiving truth. Back in Washington, the opposite was happening. Vance was no longer just vice president. He'd become de facto spiritual leader of the conservative movement. His office was inundated with calls. Not just politicians scrambling to declare allegiance, but grassroots organizers, state party chairmen, county commissioners. They all wanted one thing, for him to come speak to their people. They didn't want a politician. They wanted the man who'd spoken truth. That morning, he was scheduled for sit-down interview with nation's most respected and feared political anchor, a woman named Corinne Dillard, known for sharp intellect and refusal to suffer fools. Millions tuned in. "Mr. Vice President," she began, tone professional but laced with curiosity. "Last night was one of the most extraordinary moments in modern political history. What was going through your mind when former Vice President Mike Pence publicly called you a puppet?" Vance leaned back, posture calm, demeanor anything but triumphant. "Honestly, Corinne," he said, voice quiet and clear, "my first feeling was sadness." The anchor raised perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Sadness, not anger." "No, sadness," he repeated. "Because I saw a man who'd been given one of the greatest honors in this country, the chance to serve the American people alongside a truly great president. And I saw that man reduced to a vessel of bitterness and personal pride. He chose to chase applause of Georgetown cocktail circuit over his allegiance to millions of forgotten men and women who trusted him. That's tragedy. It's worthy of sadness." Dillard nodded slowly, impressed. "And the folder you produced, critics are already calling it calculated political assassination." "The truth is never an assassination," Vance replied smoothly. "The truth is a disinfectant. Rot in our political system on both sides of the aisle thrives in the dark. It thrives on secret deals and whispered promises. I simply chose to turn on the lights. The American people can handle the truth. It's the politicians who hide from it that you have to worry about." The interview continued, but narrative had been set. Online reaction was overwhelming. Hashtags "Truth is a disinfectant" and "#turn on the lights" began trending. People weren't just cheering for political victory. They were embracing new philosophy of leadership, one that valued transparency over empty rhetoric. When interview ended, Vance didn't go to meeting with strategists or donors. He went home, walked into his house in quiet Virginia suburbs, and was immediately tackled by his 8-year-old son. As he tucked the boy into bed that night, his son looked up with wide, serious eyes. "Daddy, some kids at school said that man on TV was right. They said you were just President Trump's puppet." Vance froze, question hitting with more force than any political attack. He sat down on edge of bed. "Well, son," he said softly, "sometimes when you stand up for a good person being attacked by bullies, the bullies and their friends try to call you names to make you feel weak. They call you a puppet to try and make you stop standing up for what's right." The boy's eyes welled up. "But you didn't yell at him. You weren't a bully back." Vance smiled, gentle, tired smile, and brushed hair off his son's forehead. "Because real strength, buddy, doesn't have to scream. Real strength is just telling the truth quietly and calmly, even when your voice is shaking." The boy threw arms around his father's neck and hugged him tight. "You're my hero, Daddy." Vance swallowed hard against lumpen throat and kissed his son's head. "No, you're mine." As he stood in doorway watching his son drift to sleep, weight of past 24 hours settled on his shoulders. Political battles, media frenzy, praise and attacks, it all faded into background. This was the reason he fought. For this little boy. For every child in America who deserved to grow up in a country where truth still mattered, where honor was more than just a word, and where leaders didn't run from the fire. And with that thought, he knew with quiet, unshakable certainty that he had to go back into the fight, because it had only just begun. In days that followed, quiet but profound shift occurred across country. In small-town classroom in Ohio, 7th grade civics teacher Mrs. Langston put away standard textbook. Instead, she played clip of Vance's speech for students. Grainy video filled room, quiet intensity of his words silencing usually restless class. When it was over, she turned to students, eyes misty. "All right," she said softly, "forget the book for a minute. What did you feel when you watched that?" Young girl in back, shy student who rarely spoke, raised hand. He made it feel like he was talking to my grandpa, she said. Like he actually cared about normal people, not just politics. Another student, boy whose father had been laid off from local auto parts plant, added. It felt real, like he wasn't just reading words off screen. He was mad about same things my dad gets mad about. Mrs. Langston nodded, tear tracing path down her cheek. That, she said, voice thick with emotion, is what leadership is supposed to be. It's not about sounding smartest or yelling loudest. It's about having courage to stand for something real, even when everyone else is telling you to sit down and be quiet. On television screen, frozen on close-up of Vance's determined face, echo of his words seemed to linger. Cowards run from fire. Leaders walk through it. In that small classroom, hundreds of miles from Washington bubble, J.D. Vance was no longer just vice president. He'd become a lesson in courage, a symbol of forgotten ideal. Back at the Capitol, aftershocks were still reshaping landscape. Lauren, Vance's chief of staff, knocked gently on his office door. "Come in," he said, looking up from stack of briefing papers. She entered but didn't speak, eyes red-rimmed. "Sir," she began, voice trembling, "I need to tell you something." Vance stood, concern on his face. "What's wrong, Lauren?" She sat down, clutching tissue. "I used to work for him," she confessed, words spilling in rush. "For Pence. I was junior staffer on his gubernatorial campaign. I believed in him. I defended him to my family even after he turned his back on President Trump. I kept making excuses." Vance remained silent, listening with patient intensity. "But after what you did," she said, pausing to steady voice. "After you stood up there and spoke truth that so many of us were too afraid to even whisper, you reminded me why I got into this work in first place. It wasn't for title or career. It was to fight for people I grew up with." She wiped tear from eye. "You didn't just expose a man, sir. You healed something broken in a lot of us." Vance walked over and placed gentle hand on her shoulder. "We've all put our faith in wrong people at some point, Lauren. What matters is that we have courage to find our way back to truth." "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "It was worth it." Outside his office, other staff members moved with new sense of purpose. Cynicism that so often permeates Washington had been replaced by quiet, fervent belief. They weren't just working for politicians anymore. They were soldiers in a cause. Later that night, Vance was summoned to Oval Office. He found Trump standing by resolute desk, looking out window at South Lawn, bathed in soft glow of evening lights. Didn't turn around when Vance entered. "It was a masterpiece, J.D.," Trump said, voice unusually subdued. "Thank you, Mr. President," Vance replied, approaching slowly. Trump finally turned and Vance stopped in his tracks. The president's eyes were wet. Man famous for impenetrable toughness, for refusing to show weakness, had tears in his eyes. "You reminded me of something tonight," Trump said, voice heavy with rare vulnerability. "Something I think even I was starting to forget in all the noise and fighting, that this isn't about us. It's not about me. It's not about you." He gestured toward window, toward unseen country beyond. "It's about them, the forgotten ones, the ones who work with their hands and pray on their knees, the heartland." Vance lowered head respectfully. "They just need someone who won't abandon them when fight gets hard." "And last night," Trump said, voice regaining strength, "they found him." The two men stood in silence, shared understanding passing between them deeper than politics. Bond forged in common love for country they both felt was slipping away. For first time in long time, White House didn't feel like political fortress under siege. It felt like home. As nation rallied around its new conservative hero, final quiet scene played out. An envelope hand-delivered by mail clerk was placed on Vance's desk, marked urgent but no return address. Just child's name scrawled in blue ink, Mason H. age 11. Nebraska. Vance opened it. Handwriting was crooked, spelling imperfect, but words were dagger to heart. "Dear Mr. Vance, my dad used to be a big Mike Pence guy. We had his sign in our yard. But after he was mean to President Trump, my dad got real sad. He said he didn't have anyone to believe in anymore. Yesterday, we watched you on the news. My dad cried. I only ever saw him cry when my dog died. He said you reminded him of what it means to be a real American. He said he feels proud again. Thank you for being brave when the other guys were scared. You are not a puppet. You are a lion. Sincerely, Mason." Vance folded letter slowly, carefully, and held it to his chest. There were no cameras, no audience, but tears filled his eyes and streamed down his face. This was why he fought. Not for power, not for headlines, not for history, but for Mason. For Mason's dad. For every forgotten voice in every forgotten town who was just waiting, praying for someone to finally tell truth. The future had arrived, and its name was J.D. Vance. If this story moved you, if it gave you reason to hope, please hit that like button right now. If you believe, as we do, that truth and courage are what this country needs, subscribe to this channel and share this story with just one person who has lost faith. Let's remind America what it means to be brave, together.